Okay, so this video is going to be about the nature of faith and how a person will be able to test a claim of an immaterial thing. So, essentially speaking, because what is immaterial is not empirically observable, the only way that one can actually test it is based on how does that thing interact with the material universe. So for example, I'm going to use a couple of different faiths as examples here, but so a person becomes a Christian, and according to Galatians 5:22 and 23, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, temperance, faith, and there were a few others, but I don't, off the top of my head, I'm not quite remembering them, but there's 9 fruits of the Spirit. So according to Christianity, if a person is truly walking in the Spirit of Christ, then they will bear these fruits. One of them was also long-suffering. So ultimately, if a person converts to Christianity from, say, pick anything, but I'm just going to pick an example. So say there's a drug addict on the street who converts to Christianity, and very rapidly he gets off the drugs, he gets a job, and then he finds himself a hardworking and much more compassionate person than he was before. Now this fruit that the gospel has borne in his life is the evidence that we can have that there is something immaterial going on here. And I will also bring another possible example. So for example, say that same person ends up getting locked up and falls in with the Muslim Brotherhood or something like this, and then he comes out and his new faith convinces him that he wants to go and join ISIS or something like that, just one of the radical Islamic groups. And then he goes and he blows up a crowded restaurant. Well, this is fruit born in his life by something immaterial, an immaterial change to him and in his life. But it is bad fruit. And as Jesus said, every tree is known by its fruit. So it's not enough to just say, and it's not enough to just go with immaterial things exist and therefore all testing and all reason or rationality goes out the window. It's not really how it works. It's a starting point from which you then reason about immaterial things. So if I was to look at a person whose faith leads them to commit an act of terrorism, I would say that, yes, I do actually believe that there is something immaterial going on there. My faith does accept the existence of evil spirits who also want to be worshipped as gods. So if this person's faith has caused them to commit an act of terrorism, then I would say that they are following the advice and the teachings and the doctrines of a bad spirit. It is bad fruit that comes from a bad tree. Now, using this same kind of thing, one can also discern what qualifies as false Christianity and what qualifies as true Christianity. This also works for any other ideology. So you could determine what qualifies as a true Muslim and a false Muslim based on how their actions actually line up with what is dictated by their own faith. So, for example, if a person claimed to be a Christian, for example, and I'm going to bring up the Crusades, if a person claims to be a Christian and they go out following blindly the orders of, the Vatican or one of these others, and they go and they commit murders and they go to war, supposedly and ostensibly in the name of Christ, we take their actions and we compare them to what is mandated by Christ himself. Now Jesus did say, the Son of Man is not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them. And then there are the other verses regarding not to avenge yourselves, but to give place unto wrath, for God has said, vengeance is mine, I will repay. So ultimately speaking, if a person claims to be a Christian, but then they go out and do things that are entirely contrary to what Christ has commanded, then they have no part with him. They're not walking in his spirit. And they're not bearing the fruits that come from that tree. So you can determine if it's actually coming from that tree by whether or not their actions actually line up. And one could do this with anything. For example, if a person claims to be a white supremacist, we'll just go with this, but they have at least, like most of their friends are not actually white, for example. And they actually like all of those people better than they like most of their white supremacist friends. At the end of the day, that person is not really a true white supremacist. I know this often brings up the idea of the no true Scotsman fallacy, but a white supremacist who does not act like a white supremacist is not a white supremacist, even if they claim the name white supremacist. Likewise, a Christian who does not change their life and try to conform more and more, and who is not, throughout the course of their life, conformed more and more to the image of Christ, is not a Christian, or not walking in the faith, not walking in the Spirit. So ultimately, through the way that an immaterial thing can actually mediate a material change in one's life, one can determine that there is something actual immaterial going on. For example, such a thing like the flying spaghetti monster, for example. We'll just go with this. This is honestly more of a rhetorical device than anything else, which is made fairly obvious by the fact that nobody actually acts like there is a flying spaghetti monster, nobody actually thinks there's a flying spaghetti monster, blah, 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 blah. It's used entirely as a rhetorical device by atheists and people who want to have a good joke. And so, because such a claim makes absolutely no changes in the way a person lives, in the way that a person's lifestyle is mediated, it bears absolutely no fruit of any kind in anyone's life, I could then very safely say there is no tree at all. If anything else, like if it's anything, it's just a weed that takes up space. But for example, say a person who was religious then becomes an atheist and that causes changes in their life, I can say that there is something immaterial going on there. I would consider that to be something analogous to a spiritual death, but maybe not 100%. Basically, a person who is religious becomes an atheist. This alters the way that they interact with the world, and so I can say there is some kind of a spiritual change being mediated there. But ultimately, the only way to really study anything spiritually is by faith, and by observing what faith actually causes in the lives of other people. So when asked about proof that the gospel is true, very often I will point to the faith of the apostles and the faith of those who followed the apostles, because they believed that they had seen Christ rise from the dead, and because they believed it, they were willing to die for that belief. And ultimately speaking, you can bat that around all you'd like. There is something spiritual, something immaterial going on there when a person like Saul of Tarsus, who is going out and making it his mission to exterminate Christianity, pulls a 180-degree flip, claims that Jesus is the Son of God, and then dies for that belief. Something has happened here. And, I mean, you can debate about what it is, but something has happened. And the fruit that it bore in his life was a conviction, was a very strong love for the people around him. It was a very strong desire to go and spread this message to the entire world. And from the things that he was doing, I mean, he would go from city to city, and he would take collections from one city that was more prosperous, and then he would take it to an area that was more downtrodden and was poor, and so on and so forth, and he would try and mediate the love of other Christians for each other, and so on and so on. And he was also a remarkably hard worker. He didn't really take up too much in the way of collection for himself. He would work with his own hands, make tents. So, this was an itinerant preacher who worked for a living, who died for his faith, and who showed a remarkable quantity of love for everyone around him, and a great deal of respect for the authorities when he was actually brought up to them. So ultimately speaking, this bore enormously good fruit in his life. This turned a murderer and a persecutor into a perfect upstanding citizen of absolutely every place that he happened to be in. I mean, that is the evidence that there is something spiritual going on, is what his faith mediates in his life. So, this is, basically, there is evidence that one can look at of an immaterial thing, but it is only how an immaterial thing changes the material thing. And in this case, when we're talking about faith, when we're talking about God, how does that God change the person? And for example, here would be another possibility. If a person claims to believe in a God, and yet they change all of the attributes of their God whenever it suits their own purposes, it could be pretty safely argued that they do not actually believe that that God actually exists. So they're just doing whatever they actually want to, whenever they actually want to. So basically speaking, I'm just trying to get you guys, I hope you'll consider these things, and I hope you'll just try and keep an open mind. Which is not to say don't test anything and don't discern anything. The scripture does say, prove all things, hold fast that which is good. And with that, I will say, may the Spirit of God lead you into all truth, and have a very good night.